All right, welcome everybody to All About Gauge. My name is Dana. I am the editor of Fave Crafts, and I'll be emceeing today's class. In case you're not familiar with Fave Crafts, we're a website that shares free craft tutorials from all over the internet. We have a variety of free email newsletters broken down by interest, like Everyday Crochet, Easy Does Knit, Trash to Treasure, Faithfully Homemade, and more. You can sign up for any of our free newsletters at favecrafts.com. A few housekeeping items. We are recording today's class, and we will be emailing a copy of that recording tomorrow in about 24 hours. So keep an eye on your email for an email from Fave Crafts via Zoom tomorrow, again, about 24 hours from now. You can use the Q&A feature to ask questions, or you can pop them in the chat. Sometimes the chat moves quickly, so it's a little easier to see questions in the Q&A feature, but wherever makes sense, go ahead and ask us questions throughout the presentation, since we're live today with our expert instructor. Let's see, I want to thank our instructor, our sponsor for today's class, which is Knitting with Chopsticks. Today's class is sponsored by Knitting with Chopsticks. When Hortense first got into crochet, she was drawn to crochet blankets by the fact that they are often mindless projects that she could work on after a busy day while watching her favorite show. Plus, they're great gifts. The sheer variety of styles, constructions, and techniques you can use to crochet blankets blows her mind, and she can't wait to share them with you during the Crochet Blanket Summit in a few days. During this free event happening September 16th through 18th, so that's this weekend, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, turn your creativity into crochet blankets you'll be proud of. The speaker lineup is incredible. There's about 20 speakers, 20 presentations. And the 3 days are jam-packed with fun surprises that you won't want to miss. So your free ticket, it's free, your free ticket to the Crochet Blanket Summit includes 24-hour access to the summit presentations once they air. But you have the option to upgrade your ticket to include the Crochet Blanket Super Pack. This will give you ongoing access to watch the presentations at your own pace, plus a whole lot of amazing extras. So you'll get all the details and the special offer after you click to register. And I'm going to drop that link that's on the slide here into the chat so you guys can sign up. So it's this weekend, it's all virtual. Learn how to master crochet blankets. All right, and then last but not least, I'm going to introduce our instructor today. So Hortense is the designer behind Knitting with Chopsticks. Knitting with Chopsticks was created as a way to give back and share easy knitting and crochet patterns with beginners everywhere. Her goal is to break down patterns so they're simple enough for you to create exactly what you want, the way you want it. She's an engineer by trade and a crafter by passion, which means all of her patterns have an extreme attention to detail, thorough explanations, and step-by-step pictures. When she's not working on a yarn project, you might find her diving at the beach or rewatching Grey's Anatomy for the 100th time and snacking on chocolate. She is from Belgium, after all. Wonderful. Welcome, Hortense. Thank you so much for teaching today's class.
Thank you for having me. So let me share my screen so I can show you my presentation. That's just easier for everyone to follow along.
Thanks.
And then we should do this. Let's make it focus. Okay, so is this working? Can you see the presentation right?
It looks good to me. Let's see. I don't see anything in the chat yet. Perfect. That says they can't.
If there's anything, let us know.
Works
so
perfectly.
I'm Hortense from Knitting with Chopsticks. Dana nicely introduced myself, so I don't need to do that anymore. Today, I want to talk to you guys everything about gauge. So what is gauge? Knitting versus crochet and any differences, why you need to make a gauge swatch, how to make a good gauge swatch, and what to do when you don't meet the pattern's gauge. And then we'll have a live Q&A session. If you can pop all your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll get to them at the end, just so that everything stays coherent and structured. If you don't mind, that would be awesome. So what is gauge? Just to put it simply, the pattern gauge is how many stitches and how many rows you should have using the recommended yarn and hook or needles in a 10 centimeter or 4-inch square. So 10 centimeters, 4 inches is the traditional gauge size, but like some designers may decide to do otherwise. I know I sometimes do when I'm making like any projects that are like round and flat. I will give like the gauge after a few rows, rounds, rather than the traditional 10 by 10 centimeter, just because that makes more sense to work up a few rows and see if you meet my size rather than making a swatch. But traditionally, it's a 10 by 10 centimeter square. So for example, if a pattern says you have a gauge of 16 stitches by 20 rows in double crochet, it means that if you chain 16 stitches or you cast on 16 stitches and you crochet or knit for 20 rows in like double crochet, you would have 10 centimeters 4-inch square. Now it's important to follow the stitch pattern given in the gauge measurement because some stitch pattern are very different to others. For example, in crochet, if you have like a single crochet or a double crochet, like a double crochet is double the height of a single crochet, so you will definitely have a different number of rows if you don't use the right stitch for your gauge swatch. If no stitch is mentioned in the gauge measurement, you should use the main stitch of your pattern or project. So if the pattern only says like 16 stitches by 20 rows and nothing else, look through your pattern and try to see which is the stitch that's used the most and use that to make your swatch. Now let's have a look at like knitting versus crochet. So actually like gauge and swatching is very, very similar between both crafts. The concept is just the same. Any math is just the same. The only difference is that in knitting, you're using knitting needles and in crochet, you're using a hook. But like all the rest is the same. So that's why I chose to like open up this class for both knitters and crocheters. I also do both, so that makes sense. There's a few places where I have like a small difference or like a different tip for each craft, but I'll make sure I highlight it clearly for each. And if I use any examples, I'll try to give them for both crafts, so you know what I'm talking about if you only do one of them. So now that we know what gauge actually is, why do we need to make a gauge swatch? So your gauge is like the base measurement of your project, and that's what the designer used to define all the sizing in a project. So if you don't follow the designer's gauge, your project dimension will end up different than intended. And well, we don't want that. Making a swatch will also help you have an idea of how your yarn will behave once it's worked up into the fabric that it's going to use for the project. So anything like drape, any stretch, bleeding, anything like that, you can have an idea with your swatch, which can be very useful. Sometimes you get like surprises and you're like, oh no, I don't want to use this yarn. It's like way too flowy or way too stretchy. I don't like the look after finishing the swatch and blocking it, which you might not have known if you started your project straight away with the yarn and then just do all of it to end up with something you don't like. That would be a pity. So I would recommend to do a gauge swatch for like every project, but there's like a few exceptions. When the final size of your project like really, really doesn't matter, like for example, amigurumi or like any stuffed animals or small toys, you don't really care if they're a bit bigger or smaller. So you can usually get fine by skipping swatch and gauge. Your proportions might end up a bit different if you crochet or knit very differently than the designer, but usually you'll be fine. Anything like baskets, any like a lot of things are often said you can get away with without swatching, like hats, gloves, and things like that. But as long as you follow like the yarn and the hook or needle size in the pattern, for those designs you should be fine. You might have a slight variation, but you don't need a precise fit, so you're good. Blankets are a bit, I don't like saying you don't need gauge for blankets, because it's true that you don't care if it's like a few centimeters bigger, but because it's such a big project, a small difference in gauge might make a big difference in your blanket, and you might not want like a blanket that's like 20 centimeters or like that's like 8 inches bigger than intended. So then it's good to still like have a look at your gauge, even if you can have like more tolerance for like a difference with the gauge from the pattern. So for anything that's like fitted, like garments, socks, it really is worth making a gauge swatch. And if you choose to use a different yarn and a different hook or needle size than what the pattern recommends, you should definitely make a gauge swatch and look into that. I've had someone send me an email and they were using a super bulky yarn for a pattern that was intended for DK weight, and they were not happy that their garment turned out huge. They didn't look at their gauge. They didn't know about the different yarn weights. Obviously, it turned into a disaster, which I was really sorry about. But if you don't look at the gauge, you cannot expect the dimensions to make sense. So now that we know why it's important, well, I hope I convinced you why it's important to look into your gauge and check that before you get started. How do you actually make a good swatch and check your gauge? So it's like a 3-step process. So first, you're gonna make your swatch, then you're gonna measure it, and finally, you make any adjustment you need. So let's look into making the swatch. So you're gonna start by like chaining or casting on the recommended number of stitches in your pattern gauge info, plus a few extra stitches. So if your pattern says your gauge is 20 stitches, you cast on or chain 20 plus like 5. We add those extra stitches because the edges of your fabric will behave differently than the middle section, and your gauge should be measured in the middle of your fabric, like to make it accurate and to make it like make sense when you scale it for a bigger project. You should not look into those edges and how they skew your final measurements. So that's why we add a few stitches. I generally like to recommend like 5 to 10 extra stitches for like any yarn weights that are like worsted or above. Anything thinner, I would add 10 to 20 stitches, especially if you're like crocheting. You can get away with adding less stitches than if you're knitting. Knit gauge is usually tighter, so you have like more stitches per 10 centimeters. So you would need more stitches for like the edge to have like the same width. While in crochet, like you need less stitches per 10 centimeters, so you can get away with having less edge stitches, basically. So now that you like cast on or change your recommended number of stitches, you can start crocheting your swatch or like knitting your swatch, and you'll make the number of rows that's given in your gauge info, plus same as for the stitches, 5 to 20, depending on your yarn weight. Again, it's important to make sure you follow the stitch pattern that's given in your gauge, or that's like the main stitch pattern from your project. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense basically to make a gauge swatch. So if you're crocheting, for example, and your swatch is like your gauge, sorry, is given in double crochet, if you're using single crochet to make your swatch, you're not gonna end up with anything that makes sense. But same for knitting. It's much less visible in knitting because the difference is smaller, but there is a difference. So if you're knitting, for example, in stockinette, don't use gartered stitch to make your swatch. It won't make sense. So make sure you use the same stitch pattern as recommended. So typically, like the designer will give you that, but as I said, like if it's not mentioned precisely in the gauge information, you can find the gauge information. Usually it has like its own section at the beginning of the pattern, or some designer will put it like with the notes or with the abbreviations. Just make sure you read all the text that like you like to skip over and ignore. Everything that goes before row 1 is important information. We don't put it there for nothing. Take a look and find your gauge info. So like the gauge is what the designer uses to make all the dimensions. So it's definitely an important information. Now, if you're making a project that's done in the round, you should make your swatch in the round. So that's something I think a lot of people skip or like ignore. But your tension can be very different whether you're working in the round or working in rows back and forth. So for example, your tension on the wrong side rows can be very different from your tension on the right side rows. So let's look at, for example, knitters. When you work in the round for stockinette, you will knit every stitch and just keep knitting, knitting, knitting. But when you work flat, you will do 1 row of knitting, 1 row of purling, and alternate this way. You've probably noticed that your purl stitches tend to have a different tension than your knit stitches. So if you make your gauge swatch flat while you're working your project in the round, your tension won't be representative of your actual project. So your gauge will be different from what you actually get when you start making the project. So it's not like, it doesn't make sense to do it this way. For crocheter, it's just the same. If you work your project in the round, there's like 2 different ways of working projects in the round for crochet. Some designers like to make 1 round and then make you join in the round and turn again. If your design is like that, you're fine with working your gauge swatch flat, because you're turning at every round. So it's just the same as like turning at every row. But if you're working like always in the same direction, either like continuously or even like with joining after a chain, you will, like, your stitches will always be in the same direction, and your tension and gauge will be different than if you're working in rows back and forth. Crochet stitches tend to be skewed to one side, depending on the stitch, more or less. So it will make a difference in your like final gauge. And if you measure one gauge and you meet the pattern gauge, but then your project is actually done a different way and you don't have the same gauge as the one you measured, your end results and end dimensions won't be correct. So it would be a pity to go to all the trouble of making a swatch, but not making the right swatch. So for swatches in the round, unfortunately, you need to use 2.5 to 3 times more stitches than the gauge info, because you're like gonna make it like double fabric and lay it flat to measure. So you don't have a choice than making it like double the quantity. But for knitters, there's like a trick where you can use like this floating technique. I showed like a quick picture here. Basically, you're working like half of your tube diameter in knitting, and then the other half is just like a float. And when you're done making your swatch, you will just like cut all your floats and block it flat, and then you have a appropriate measurement. There's a lot of YouTube tutorials to tell you exactly how to do that, so don't hesitate to look it up. If you just type like swatching in the round for knitting, you will find it for sure. So make sure you take that into account if your project is worked in the round. So now that you've done your swatch, you have a nice little square, and the next step is to block it. I know, you don't want to do that, but you have to. Well, you don't have to, but I highly recommend you to. So if you're not familiar with blocking, blocking is when you help your project take its best shape, usually with the help of water or steam. It's a very simple process, but it makes a big difference in how polished and finished your project look. So I highly recommend doing it. I have a full tutorial on my website. If you need that, don't hesitate to reach out. So my advice is, if you want to like avoid blocking, start by blocking every gauge swatch and like follow the rules before, like learn the rules before you break them. So do it for every project. And once you feel like comfortable and you know how your yarn is behaving after blocking, you can sort of like guesstimate and avoid blocking and take the risk of having like a difference and having to frog or having your thing not fit perfectly. If you're fine with that, you can go ahead and skip blocking. But blocking your swatch will also give you a ton of other information about your final project, like your drape, the feel of the fabric, the shine, if your yarn is bleeding or not, all that kind of thing, which can be really nice to know before you do the full project. For example, if your drape, like your yarn gets very, very drapey, and that's not something you want for your final project, it's good to know when you're making the swatch rather than at the end of your project. So that's why I would recommend blocking your gauge swatch too. And before we go on to step 2 and measurements, I think Dana has a few more info to share.
All right. So we're gonna do our intermission now. I'm gonna talk about upcoming classes and our digital magazines. We always offer an introductory rate to our digital magazines to folks who attend our classes. So bear with me just a second. All right, so folks should see my Learn to Sew the Hold Tight Folio screen, hopefully. Okay, fantastic. Awesome, great, thanks. So, our upcoming classes for the rest of this month, we actually have classes the next 2 weeks in a row. Usually we're every other week. So next week we've got this class on sewing the hold tight folio. It's a little sewing folio to store sewing pins and magnetic sewing pins. Magnetic sewing pins are made by a company called Sew Tights, so they are our sponsor for that class. You'll learn how to make this cute little project. It's great for on-the-go sewing, or just for extra storage. So that's taking place next Tuesday at the same time, 11 a.m. Central. And I will drop the links to sign up for any upcoming classes in the chat after the intermission. And then up next is the week after, so 2 weeks from now, we have an embroidered knots class. If anybody attended our textural embroidery class back in May, it's the same instructor. That's M Creative J. It's Melissa Galbraith, and she'll be teaching you 4 new embroidery stitches during that class. So that's on Tuesday, September 26th, and that's at noon Central. So an hour later than our typical time. And thank you so much for attending today's class. And like I said, we always offer an introductory rate to our digital magazine. So that's I Like Knitting and I Like Crochet to anybody who attends. So if you've never signed up before, these digital magazines publish 6 times a year. And for $5 US, you can get access to those 6 issues. Plus, because they're digital magazines, you get access to all of the previously published patterns. So these magazines have been around since like 2014, 2015. There's hundreds of patterns, tips and techniques, tutorials, and more already available in the archive for you to check out. So the codes to get those, and I'll put them in the chat as well, are ilikeknitting.com/virtual23 or ilikecrochet.com/virtual23. I'm going to stop my screen share and turn it back over to Hortense.
So let me get my presentation back up. Okay. So we made our swatch and now we need to measure it. So you might think that's like easy peasy, just measure, but there's a few things to be aware. So you're gonna lay it flat to measure it, like don't put it just on your lap or something like that. Put it on a decent flat surface. And you're gonna take your ruler and measure how many stitches you have for like 10 centimeters, 4 inches, and the same like vertically how many rows you have. There's some like cool like square wooden thingies that have like an open space and that are just a perfect size for a swatch or like a gauge that you just put on your project, and you have like, you can see directly 10 centimeters, 4 inches. So those are really convenient if you're like me and you get all your like stitch count. When you have like 20 plus stitches, my eyes start to get like this and I don't see like half stitches anymore. So those are very helpful. So make sure you measure in the center of your swatch. I think I've mentioned before, like the edges behave differently. So try to measure as much as possible in the center of your swatch. Now for crocheters specifically, there's something else to be careful with. In crochet, your stitch, like there's a little gap between stitches, like it's a bit more open than in knitting. You need to take that little gap into account when you measure. So you need to take like a full stitch is the yarn stitch and the gap up until the next stitch. So if you look at the example I have here, the first one is measured correctly. You start at the beginning of the stitch and you end after the gap of the, like, I think there's 5 stitches, after the gap of the 5th stitch, just before the start of the 6th stitch. That's like 5 full stitches. In the next example, where it's done incorrectly, you start at the beginning of the stitch and you end right at the end of the stitch without taking into account that's like small gap. And you can see like you get a smaller measurement for like the same 5 stitches. So that's not correct. And the last example shows you like measuring at the beginning of the gap for the first stitch up to after the gap for the last and 5th stitch. So you actually have like 1 gap too much and you will get like a bigger measurement than the actual value. So this is something to be mindful of, especially when you're working with thicker yarns or if you have like a very open stitch, open work. If you use like a small hook, a big hook for small yarn, sorry, you will have like more gaps in between your stitches. So make sure you take these into account correctly when you measure. Usually we like to measure up to like a half stitch or half row. I know like some magazines and some books require designer to have gauge match like to full stitches or full rows. But a lot of patterns are still like with half stitches. So you can sort of like estimate like, okay, this is more or less half a stitch. I'm not good enough to tell you like it's 0.2 stitches. So that's why we just stick to half stitches. So I recommend you do the same when you measure. Now, if you're not feeling sure about how to like measure your work and know how many stitches or rows you made in this like 10 centimeter 4-inch square, there's another option. We can do like a little bit of math. Don't panic, I will tell you everything. So when you make your swatch, just write down how many stitches you chained or cast on and how many rows you've crocheted or knitted. So while you make it, just write down exactly how many you did. This is especially useful when you're making like stitch repeats or stitch patterns that are like harder to read, any like lace or cables or things like that that are sometimes confusing to read afterwards exactly how many rows there are. You can do this instead. So once you've made your swatch and written down exactly how many rows and how many stitches you've done, you can measure your swatch after blocking in both directions. And then you can use like a simple pro rata rule to calculate how many stitches for 10 centimeters or 4 inches. So let me walk you through a quick example. I'm going to do it in centimeter first and then in inches. So just ignore the part that has measurements you're not familiar with, so you don't get too confused. So let's say you chained or cast on 24 stitches and you crochet or knitted 30 rows. Now you measure your swatch and it's 12 centimeter wide by 15 centimeter high. So you need to divide the number of stitches by the width you measured. So you had 24 stitches divided by 12 centimeters. So you have 2 stitches per centimeter. Now you need the number for 10 centimeters. So you just multiply 2 stitches by 10 and you have 20 stitches. So you have 20 stitches for 10 centimeters. Now to figure out the row count, you basically do just the same. You divide the number of rows you counted by the height you measured. So you had 25 rows and you divide that by 15 centimeters. It gives you 1.7 rows per centimeter, which you again need to multiply by 10 because we need it for 10 centimeters. So that's 17 rows for 10 centimeters. So here, make sure you don't round up any numbers until your like final result, where you can round up to like half a stitch. If you round up throughout the calculation, you will get like a very different result. So if, for example, the 1.7, I would have rounded it to 1.5, I would get 15 rows instead of 17, which is actually a big difference. So try to keep as many digits as is like reasonable to make sure you get the most accurate result in the end. Now, if we look at the example for inches, the math is exactly the same, but instead of multiplying by 10 centimeters, you're going to multiply by 4 inches. So we chained and cast on 24 stitches again and crocheted or knitted for 30 rows. You measure your swatch and it's 4.75 inches wide and 6 inches high. So that's the same measurements as before, but like converted to inches. So now you divide the number of stitches by the width you measured. So 24 stitches divided by 4.75 inches is 5 stitches per inch. Since you need the number for 4 inches, you multiply 5 stitches by 4 and you get 20 stitches for 4 inches. So that's the same 20 stitches as we had before. Now to figure out the rows, you divide the number of rows you counted by the height you measured. So 25 rows divided by 6 inches is 4.2 rows per inch. Since you need the number of rows for 4 inches, you multiply 4.2 by 4 and you get 17, which is the 17 rows we had earlier. So this method is a little bit less precise than the measuring method because you're taking into account those edges that tend to behave differently. So if you want to use this method, I would recommend making a bigger swatch. The bigger swatch, the smaller the impact of those edges in your calculation. But it works really well for designs that are like not super fitted, and it's way better than not doing a gauge swatch at all and not looking into it at all. So now that you measured your swatch, write down what is your gauge and which hook or needle you used. And then we can compare it to the patterns and see if we need to adjust and how. So what do you do if your gauge doesn't match the designer or the pattern's gauge? Sorry. So it depends in which way it varies. So if you have more stitches, less stitches, it's different what you should do. So let's look at each case one by one. So first case, you have more stitches than the designer, which means you have been crocheting or knitting more tightly because your stitchers are like smaller and you fit more stitches in 10 centimeters. So you should try to go up 1 or 2 hook sizes or needle sizes. And that will usually help you like get a looser tension and get less stitches per 10 centimeters. Another way, like another thing you can do to change your gauge is you can switch yarns. You can work with a thicker yarn, but that will like impact your project quite a lot. And you probably don't want to change yarns. Like usually you know which yarn you want to work for your project and you don't want to go and buy another yarn. But if that's an option, that can work too. Sometimes it can also help to switch your hook or needle material. So for example, knitting or crocheting with bamboo usually gives you a tighter tension than metal needles or hooks. So this difference can be like smaller than changing hook sizes. So if you try 2 hook sizes and you're right in between, this can be the trick to make you land the perfect gauge. You can also switch brands. So like even within the same material, I know like for knitting, I have a set of needles that are pointier than the other one. And like my gauge is different from one to the, like if I switch needles. Unfortunately, I discovered that mid-project, which was not a good idea, but anyway. So that can be like a trick too. If you're like close, but not perfect and you still want to like adjust it. If you have a different set of needles or a different set of hooks, try and see if that one does the trick. Now, if you have fewer stitches than the pattern gauge, it means you've been crocheting or knitting looser than the designer. So you can try to do the exact opposite. So go down 1 or 2 hook or needle sizes, or like switch materials, but like the other way around. So if you were knitting with metal, you can go to bamboo, things like that. That would usually help you. So meeting the stitch gauge is like the most important usually in a pattern. A lot of patterns will give you like the height in like centimeters or inches rather than in number of rows, so that you can focus on the stitch gauge and like have the row height be a little bit less precise, and that's fine. Often also like adjusting your stitch gauge will also adjust your row gauge at the same time, because if you crochet looser, like your whole stitch is going to get looser or tighter. But if you have like the correct number of stitches, but you have too many rows, there's still some things you can do. I find it much harder because you need to adjust the way you crochet or knit. And that's really hard for me to stay consistent throughout the project because I've been knitting and crocheting a lot and I usually go back to doing it my way. But what you can do, so if you have more rows, it means you've been crocheting too tight, so you need to loosen up. So to do that, you can like anytime you crochet and you pull up a loop, you just pull it up a little bit higher than you usually would, and that will like make your stitch higher. And in knitting, you can do just the same. You will just work less close to the tip and just like pull up your stitch a little bit more anytime you make your stitch. And this will make it a little bit higher. Now, if you have fewer rows, which means you have been knitting or crocheting too loose compared to the designer, you can do the exact opposite. So anytime you pull up a loop, you pull it up a little bit less high than you're used to, and you can, at the end of your stitch, pull a little bit tighter on your yarn. Same with knitting, try to work closer to the tip and like tighten up every stitch after every stitch a little bit more than what you're used to. This way you get like a tighter tension. Now that you know like all the options to adjust, look at what you need based on your gauge you have and your designer gauge, and try a different hook, yarn, needle, and go back to step 1 and make a new swatch. Block your new swatch, measure your new swatch, and see if that works. if that did the trick and made enough of a difference, or if you need to adjust again. Just keep going through the circle until you found like the best match. I know this can be frustrating and take a bit of time and yarn, which I hate, but it makes a big difference. So I just want to walk you through an example of how like just one stitch in gauge difference can make how big of a difference it can make in a project. So if you're, for example, making a sweater and the pattern gauge calls for 20 stitches per 10 centimeters, but you have 19 stitches instead, and you decide, I'm done, it's fine, I just want to get started. Now, if you're a size large like me, your bust measurement will probably be around 100 centimeters, depending on the design. So the pattern would call for like 200 stitches. Now, if you're with your 19 stitch gauge, 200 stitches is actually 105 centimeter. So that's like a full 5 centimeter difference compared to what was intended by the design. So if it's a fitted garment, 5 centimeters is a lot. That's actually like half a size. So I would have like made a sweater that's between L and XL rather than a large. So that's how big of a difference it can make. So now that you like have your new hook, yarn needle, whatever, you can get started. And so that's all I have for you today. I hope this was helpful, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. I learned a ton just being, you know, a fly on the wall. So I'm thrilled. Some of the comments have been so wonderful. Joanne says she didn't realize that about a couple people actually were very surprised about gauge in the round versus straight. So that was a super helpful piece of information. And then I love the tip about the edges. That had never occurred to me before, to add a few extra stitches because the edges behave differently. So thank you for that. We do have a number of questions that have come through. So let's see. I think some of them have been addressed, but I'll relay them anyway in case other people missed those answers. So Gail is asking, what is bleeding in regard to swatch? I'm guessing color bleeding.
Yeah, it's color. So your yarn, when you like make it wet, sometimes like the color comes out. So that's good to know before you like make your sweater and like wear it and then get rain on it, for example, and get your t-shirt all like blue. Not that I'm talking about experience here.
Oh no.
Unfortunately. So yeah, then you know your yarn is going to bleed a lot, and you should like wash it a few times before you wear it or before you're gifting it, so that you don't get any bad surprises.
Great. Okay. Let's see. Barb was asking, you recommend blocking the swatch and then measuring in that.
Yes.
Fantastic. Let's see. Bobby has a pretty specific question, but I think it applies as other people, you know, approach this. So they have a pattern for crochet that states the type of yarn she used and then says with a J hook for a gauge of 6 stitches for 2 inches. So what kind of stitch?
So you should look at like the rest of the pattern and see what like the main stitch is in the pattern. So if it's like I don't know what pattern you're doing, but if it's like a sweater and it's all double crochet, then it's double crochet. If it's like a repeat, like some, I don't know, like bubbles and puffs and some sort of repeat, you just work that repeat for your swatch. If it's any lace repeat, same thing, you just work the lace repeat.
All right. Awesome. Lots of so many good questions coming through. Let's see. Barb is asking, how do you measure a swatch that was done in a cable pattern?
So just the same as any swatch, you try to read your number of rows, and if that's not so easy for you, you can use the calculation technique that I explained, where you just like, while you're making it, just like take off how many rows you've done, and then you can calculate your gauge from that.
Hey. This is a great question. I've never thought of this. Kathy's asking, if you block the swatch, can you reuse that yarn? like pull it out later.
Yes. Yeah, totally. You can. I do it all the time because I hate wasting yarn. Like I'm not gonna waste any yarn. You can totally reuse it and reblock it. It will make like noodly thing once you frog it, your swatch, but that will go away once you reblock it. So you're totally fine.
Joan is asking, when you block the swatch, do you have to pull it a little to get the right shape?
No. So you should really not pull your pull on your swatch at all when you're blocking it, because you want to know your actual measurements that you get. Like when you have your final like sweater or whatever, yes, you can pull to like cheat to get the dimensions you want. But when you're making your gauge swatch, the whole purpose is to know what dimensions you will get without any cheating. So I usually don't I don't even pin it down. I just like lay it flat to dry and let it do its thing. And then just like maybe just like the edges, if they curl up too much, like stockinette will just like roll like a old perkament thing. It will just like roll on itself. So then you do need like a few pins, but I try to pin it down the least possible and really not stretch it in any direction so that you actually get like what is your natural size.
Sweet. Awesome. Barb is asking, what if you were off by half a stitch in knitting?
So half a stitch, 1 stitch, 2 stitches, the same tricks apply to like adjust. So try like a bigger hook, bigger needle, smaller needle, or like changing materials and see if you can like meet the exact number of stitches. Half a stitch will make less difference than a full stitch, so it's better. But if you can get like the exact gauge, you're gonna get the exact measurements the designer intended.
Going through the chat now to make sure I didn't miss anything. Very early in the program, Terry left this comment. I thought it was interesting. They go, you know, they make their swatches and seem okay, but when the project is done, the gauge seems to have vanished. Have you encountered this? What tips do you have?
Yeah, so that happens for like 2 different kind of reasons. First off, like your own tension can change from one day to the other. So you can use the same materials, but if you're like stressed or if you're relaxed, your tension will change. So your gauge will change. So that's kind of on you. The other aspect is that when you like how to explain this? Some fabrics tend to grow. Like if you're crocheting and you're making like a starting chain, and then you make a few rows and it's fine, and then it tends to like grow because your stitches are looser than your starting chain. So if you make a small swatch, you might not see that growing effect as much as on a full garment. So that's why I recommend like making a swatch as big as possible. So those are like the 2 main reasons I've encountered for like your gauge to change. And sometimes mystery happens because yarn is not a perfect science, unfortunately. Also, like some yarns will behave differently, like with heat and like moisture in the air and things like that. So that might like cotton and linen yarns tend to like grow crazy when you block them. So if you block something big and you stretch it out, it will like go crazy compared to like a small swatch that you can kind of keep more reasonably sized, if that makes sense.
So many awesome questions coming in. I'm so glad that we've got so much. We still have like 15 minutes left for questions, which is great.
Keep it going.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. So Joan has a bunch of questions about gauge, which is awesome. So let's see. She says, I changed the number of stitches to cast on based on the new gauge that my swatch called for. Is this okay?
Yes. So that's the other way to do it. So if you can't meet gauge and you're comfortable with math, you can like recalculate your entire pattern to make it have like your gauge instead of the designer's gauge. But that's like way more complicated. So you're basically redesigning the pattern. You're taking like the designer's final measurements and then calculating how many stitches and how many rows you need. So that's like really good, but it's much harder to do. So usually when people follow a pattern, they try to meet the gauge of the pattern rather than like recalculate the whole thing to make it meet their needs.
Yeah. Like maybe a granny square would be fine, but like not too hard to recalculate, but a whole garment would be really intense.
Well, like a granny square is in the round, so you would have like your row and stitch that impacts in both ways. So I find it more complicated, but like if you're making just like a rectangle, like a placemat, let's say, that's just work in rows, then it's very easy. You just like calculate what size the designer intended and then recalculate with your stitches how many stitches you need and just work up to the size. But if you have like any shaping, like armhole shaping or neck shaping for garments, it gets much more complicated to adjust.
Hey. Daisy has a good question. She says, before starting a project, is there, there's a recommendation for how much yarn you need. So should you buy extra yarn so you can make a swatch?
So normally the designer will have taken the swatch yarn into account when they list how much yarn you need. And usually we do try to take a little bit extra compared to what we used, because everyone tends to crochet a bit differently. Even if you meet like the same gauge, somehow you don't always use like exact same amount of yarn. So if I used up like a full skein, like up to the last inch, I will definitely tell you to get 2 skeins, because I don't want you to get one and then get very frustrated because you can't find it again, or you can't find the dye lot or things like that. And like we've used yarn to make our gauge swatch, so logically it's coming into the final yarn requirements.
Awesome. Let's see. Joanne has a question that's a little generally related. She says, if you have time, would you be able to discuss how to recognize the different weights, I'm guessing yarn weights, when you're in the store? Because that's confusing.
Yes. So usually it's written on the label. If you're like in the US or the Canada, you're very lucky because they have like they divided yarns into 6 yarn weights, and they're like numbered 1 to 6. And usually there's like the number, like a little yarn logo with the number on it. So that's very easy. Unfortunately, in Europe, we're very stupid and we don't do that. So they will give you the total yardage and like a random gauge. I call it random because they will tell you it's this many rows and this many stitches, but like it really depends who made it. So for me, that like you can't rely on that gauge information to be like, okay, it's fine, it's the same as the pattern, I don't need to make my swatch. No, that doesn't work. But it gives you an idea if you're in the right yarn weight. So if your yarn says like 10 stitches and your gauge says 20, you're definitely not working with the right yarn. If you're like 18, 21, you're probably in the right yarn weight, and you can like use your hooks and needles and adjust this way to get like the exact gauge. I have like a little cheat sheets with all like the different yarn weights and how they're called like in all the countries. If you just go to my website, you can like go to any knitting pattern and it will just pop up if you want. You're welcome to download that.
A link to the cheat sheets and the recap email tomorrow too.
We can do that.
All right. Okay, let's see. A few more questions. A couple people are asking, is there a printout available of the file that you used for today's class?
Not so far, but I can make a sign up link and give that to you. And
okay.
You can give me the replay.
Okay.
Something you want?
A few people asked, so it sounds like
I'm happy to do it.
Awesome, fantastic. Okay, thank you. All right. Let's see. Julia's asking, is it true that going down 1 needle size changes your gauge by 1 centimeter?
No. I have never it will depend on the stitch you're using. It will depend on the yarn you're using. If you're using like super bulky yarn, it's gonna like one needle size is gonna make a bigger difference because it's like a whole millimeter difference in needle size. If you're using like small needles, it's 0.25 millimeter difference. So I've never heard that rule, but it doesn't make any sense to me.
That's interesting. Totally. Thank you. Victoria's asking, do you recommend a swatch for blankets and Afghans?
Yes, I do. You don't have to. It really depends on how, I would say, like picky you are. If you really don't care, like if it's 20 centimeters bigger or smaller and you don't care, you don't need to swatch. And you don't want to know how your yarn will feel, if it's gonna like bleed, stretch, if it's gonna stay soft or become softer or anything like that, you don't care, you're fine without a swatch. Otherwise, I would do it.
I'm working on a blanket right now that's a lot drapier than I expected because it's heavier yarn. Yeah, so I should have done a bigger, like a more of a swatch than I did. So I agree
And
with that comment. All right. For folks asking if we're going to get a copy of the presentation, we are going to email the recording tomorrow. So keep an eye out for that link in about 24 hours. Awesome. Couple more questions. Let's see. So Joan's asking, I've used a textured yarn in the past, which was thick in places and thin in others. So how do you calculate the stitches in rows? Because the swatch was wonky looking.
So that's like tricky yarn. We have some like new yarns that are like, yarn companies go crazy inventing all these like fancy yarns that are not so easy to work with. But normally like they're, because they're made with machines, unless they're like hand spun yarns, but then like you're in a different universe. But if they're made with machines, there should have some like regularity in their irregularity, if that makes sense, because like a machine can't do completely random things. So if you make your swatch and you like make it big enough and you block it, you will have parts that are like denser and parts that are like thinner, but you will still have like the same amount of stitches and rows per like 10 centimeters. I hope that made sense.
Awesome. Let's see. I think we just have like one or two more questions. Lots of people said yes, they would love the copy of this the file. So just
we'll get it to you.
That. Thank you. Joan, let's see. Sorry, I just missed the question I was looking. Janet's asking, just to confirm, do you measure your swatch before or after you block it?
After. Otherwise, why would you block it?
There you go. Good point. Joan's just commenting, if there's ever a class or a YouTube on changing gauge, she would love that. How do I find your sessions on YouTube? You can find any Favecraft Studio Live classes on the Favecrafts YouTube channel. You should just be able to search Favecrafts on YouTube. And then Hortense, you have a knitting channel or a YouTube channel, Knitting with Chopsticks, correct?
Very small one. I don't do many videos yet. I'm working on it, but like I'm left-handed, so like any practical videos are like kind of harder to make. But I love like teaching this kind of format. So I do have a few courses, but like my website is the best place to find all my, and like any videos I make are also on my website.
Okay, fantastic. Okay. Oh boy, this is a detailed question. Medora's asking, if you want to knit a sweater pattern that does not come in your size, how do you work out how to knit your size?
Okay, that's a very long one. Basically, become a designer. So you're right. This is like related to gauge, because your gauge is what's going to tell you how to calculate like your size. So first you need to figure out for like every step which dimensions you want. So if you're like between two sizes, I would like just cut in between just to make it easier. So you have like the number of stitches or row that the designer is giving you. You use the designer gauge to calculate how many centimeters or inches that does. And then you use your gauge to calculate how many stitches or rows you need. So that's like in a nutshell. But in practice, it's like basically become a designer.
All right. Barb, related to the sweater question, Barb is asking, how do you decide what size sweater to knit? She says she finds her bust size specifically is usually between sizes?
So that like kind of depends on how you like the fit. So usually the designer will give you like the final sweater dimensions or like the ease that's intended. So if you like a close fit, you can go like one size up compared to the designer if there's like a lot of ease, or the other way around. Usually you can choose this way. Like I like my clothes very loose, so all my designs are like super loose. So if you like them a bit like closer fit, just go down one size and you should be fine.
All right, I think we've got time for probably just one more question and then we'll wrap up. So the last question I have that's really good. Donna's asking, do you need to block acrylic yarn?
Acrylic yarn does block and it does like tend to behave differently after blocking. You should steam block it. Wet blocking is not going to work, but if you steam block it, it like just like any yarn, it can like grow and it will get like shiny, drapey and everything we like. So I definitely recommend blocking acrylic yarns too, even for your swatch.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to just share our last slide in the presentation here to thank you for teaching today's class. So if somebody was asking, what's your website? So it's Knitting with Chopsticks. So you can knittingwithchopsticks.com, right? Just pretty straightforward. So you can go to Hortense's website to check out all of her patterns and all of the other courses, etc. If you don't already follow her on social media, her handle is Knitting with Chopsticks, so definitely follow her work. If you have any questions about Favecraft Studio live classes, you can reach me at dneald@primecp.com or events@primecp.com and sign up for the Crochet Blanket Summit. So if you loved the format of today's class, you're going to love the format of the Crochet Blanket Summit. There's a bunch of different crochet designers in the industry, crochet and, well, no, just crochet. It's the Crochet Blanket Summit. Crochet designers.
There's like half the presentations that apply to knitting too, because like choosing your yarn, choosing your colors, those kind of things are like perfect for knitters too. So like knitters are welcome, but it's intended for crocheters.
Hey, oh, good point. Okay, awesome. Yeah, so knitters sign up as well. And if you didn't grab that link already from the chat, I'll be sending the link out in the recap email tomorrow so you guys can sign up. All right, I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Thank you again so much, Hortense, for teaching today's class. It was so good. Everyone seemed to love it. And we'll see everybody next time. All right, have a good one.